This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Well, hey everyone, it's Mark Bayer, and you are tuned to When Science Speaks. This episode of the show is sponsored by the One for the Week newsletter. One for the Week delivers high impact communication resources to inboxes every week that you can immediately apply to take your communication skills to the next level. Want one piece of communication and persuasion insight you can put to use right away to get your voice heard or to more effectively lead your team or to advance your organization's priorities? Just join the 800 subscribers of the One for the Week newsletter by going to whensciencespeaks.com/one for the week. I am so pleased to have Dr. Ashley Ruba on the show today. Ashley is a UX researcher at Meta Reality Labs, building the next generation of AR and VR technology. Prior to joining, Ashley spent over a decade in academic research, studying how young children learn about emotions. She earned her Ph.D. and master's in developmental psychology from University of Washington and bachelor's from Duke University. Welcome to the show, Ashley. It's so wonderful to have you here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So we're going to start out by where you grew up and how you first got interested in science.
Yeah, I grew up in North Carolina and I was interested in science pretty early. I really thought I was going to be an astronaut. That was the career I thought I was going to have as a child. Was very inspired by Sally Ride in particular. And so I was definitely interested in science for sure, but then I got interested in psychology at some point when I was in high school. I had a friend who unfortunately died by suicide when I was 16, and I really wanted to become a therapist. And so I knew that in order to be a therapist, I was really interested in pursuing a PhD and knew that I needed to have research experience. And I ended up, when I was at Duke for undergrad, ended up joining a development lab. And then from there, I realized that I was actually really interested in research. And by the end of undergrad, after being in that lab for 3 years, I decided that what I really wanted to pursue for my PhD was developmental psychology. So that's how I ended up moving into developmental psychology specifically.
Yeah, really interesting topic. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that backstory too. Growing up, I think about when I was growing up, and if I had certain teachers like Mr. O'Brien for modern European history and political theory at Framingham North High School back in the day, had a huge impact on me and the path that I chose. And I'm wondering if you had maybe mentors, teachers, or others along the way.
Yeah, definitely by the time I was an undergrad, I think that was the first time I had like a science mentor. And my undergraduate advisor, Makiba Wilborn, she's also a first generation college student. And so she was the person who was really mentoring me. And I think just created this space where I felt comfortable, like being at Duke. Our lab was really diverse in terms of the lab members, gender, race, socioeconomic status, and being at a pretty wealthy private school like Duke, it definitely felt. I think she used to call our lab, it was like the UN, how diverse it was compared to the general student body at Duke.
Mhm.
And it definitely felt like a safe and fun place to be at this otherwise like very wealthy university.
Yeah. I also want to ask you, you mentioned you're a first generation college student, and I have to say, like after 200 plus episodes of When Science Speaks, my operating hypothesis is that first gen scientists tend to be highly skilled science communicators. And as a first gen scientist that you are, I would love for you to comment. You don't have to agree with that. I'd love for you just to share your reaction.
Oh, I definitely agree. I think that when I go back home and I'm talking to my parents about what I do, it's definitely a lot of practice having to communicate. I'm the only scientist and only PhD in my entire extended family. So there's a lot of communication where I have to explain like what do I do on a day-to-day basis in a way that other people can understand. And I think that talking to people who are not PhDs and who are not academics, it's really helped me improve my scientific communication. And one of my best friends is also first gen Ph.D. chemical engineering, only scientist, only chemical engineer in his family. And he is one of the best like science communicators I've ever met and will explain very complicated concepts in chemical engineering in a way that like I can understand and also his entire family can understand. It's really impressive. So I would definitely agree with that statement for sure.
That is so cool. Let me ask you this, thinking back when you were in high school and maybe you were taking science courses or other courses that your parents didn't have any exposure to. My older boy is taking calculus now, and I took calculus, but like he's talking about concepts that I don't even have a cognitive like foothold in what he's saying.
Yeah.
And so sometimes I'll ask him to explain to me, and he really likes that because I think he learns better also by breaking it down and he can test his own mastery. So thinking about as you were growing up, did some of the practice start then? Because you were like in my case, like he's taking classes in high school and explaining them to me.
Yeah. I imagine that it did. I was pretty school motivated growing up, pretty self-sufficient. And yeah, definitely had this experience of like, at some point I was just beyond what my parents were able to help me with school
Mhm.
wise. And so, yeah, it was a lot of self-directed work at that point to learn these things for myself. And I definitely struggled moving into Duke. Like my first year at Duke was really hard for me. I took calculus, I did not do well. I took a physics class, I did not do well. And I think it was just really struggling with this jump between a high school curriculum and a college curriculum, which I think like, as a first gen college student, I just wasn't prepared in the way that some of my peers were who had been private school like throughout their whole life.
Yeah, those are really demanding classes, of
Yeah.
course, for anyone, but I completely understand what you're saying. I very studiously avoided math and science when I got to college. I want to talk about your research because your research is fascinating. How humans communicate, your focus on young children. Can you share with us details about your PhD and your postdoc research?
Yeah. So the broad topic of all of my academic research was how young children learn about other people's emotions. And so I studied this mostly with infants, so 10, 14, 18-month olds, and then moved a little bit into preschool age kids at the end of my postdoc. We know a lot about how children learn language, for example, which is also this very complicated communicative system where any typically developing child picks up language within a few months of life. And then after you go from this baby that like can't verbally communicate with other people, and then by the time you're 2 or 3, like you can actually start to have conversations with someone. And this is all through just observing language in your everyday life. I was interested as to whether emotions were learned in a similar or a different way to language, because emotions are obviously this very complicated system, but it seems like young children, we figure out like, what does it mean when someone is smiling? What does it mean when someone is frowning? What emotion do those correspond with? And how do we respond to regulate our behavior? So that was the general gist of all of the work that I did when I was in academic research, was just trying to figure out how are young kids learning about other people's emotions and making meaning from these emotional cues that they're observing in their everyday lives.
Yeah, and as you pointed out, it's very complicated and we're not really sure, perhaps, and science is always evolving, of course. Any like highlights or hypotheses or I don't know, findings, sometimes like too strong a word, but
Yeah.
themes maybe that emerge from your work? Because I know that listeners, well, personally, I'm really interested in anything about that. And I'm sure listeners are.
Yeah, so the predominant thinking for a really long time was that humans are born with maybe some conceptual understanding of different basic emotions like happiness, sadness, anger, fear, disgust. Either that or they like pick these things up really quickly because it's thought that some people argue that when you're happy, you smile, and when you smile, you're feeling happy. And there's a very clear mapping between what we do with our face and how whatever internal state we have.
Mhm.
But then in recent years, there had been thinking in the opposite direction where, you know, young kids like don't understand any of these like really like fine grained emotions. And instead, maybe they just understand that people feel negative or people feel positive, but it's not until they actually are learning language and labels like happiness and sadness and anger that they actually start to make more fine grained distinctions between
Mm.
these. And so my work was exploring what happens when we actually look at babies who they can't talk yet, so they don't have emotion language. what does it seem like they understand about other people's emotions before they're actually learning labels to identify other people's emotions.
Hmm.
And it seems, at least like the preliminary work that I had, it was showing that young kids seem to be able to pick up on different instances in which people might be smiling or frowning, and they are starting to make meaning from these cues. Whether or not a 10-month-old looks at someone smiling and thinks like that person is happy, I don't know. And I imagine they don't because they don't actually have that word in their vocabulary. It seems like babies, much like they pick up language really quickly, they're picking up other people's emotions really quickly. And based on what how their parents are displaying different emotions and what kind of emotions babies are seeing in their everyday lives, they're starting to make meaning from these cues that are really rich with social information.
Yeah, I love it. Just thinking about it as a non-scientist would think like the ability to do that from a maybe evolutionary standpoint way back in the mists of time would be very important to
Oh,
be
for
able to
sure. Yeah.
interpret someone's emotions like that. But you also served as a writing tutor, and good writing is hard to find everywhere.
It is.
What I'm I love I've done a lot of writing and a lot of teaching about writing. And can you share, I'd love for you your perspective on what common writing challenges your students encounter and how did you help them address them and maybe overcome them even?
Yeah, I think and so I worked with a lot of undergraduates. When I was in grad school, it was with other psychology undergraduates, and when I was an undergrad, it was with undergrads from a variety of different areas. But we're just not taught, or a lot of students aren't taught how to write that when they're in high school, or if anything, they're taught like this is how we write like a 5 paragraph essay, like a very SAT kind of prep thing. And there are just these like rules that get really ingrained in people's heads. And I think it's hard when we're trying to teach scientific writing, which is not the kind of writing that's like super flowery or I I will talk to students who they were told like vary your language so it doesn't sound boring. But in scientific writing, like it's not supposed to be super interesting necessarily. It's supposed to be skimmable. And so I'm like, no, let's not use synonyms for every different concept. Like just use the same word over and over again. Like it's going to sound boring and that's okay. And also just getting people used to like, this is how you write a paper that's longer than 5 paragraphs. This is how you integrate sources. This is how you paraphrase sources, as opposed to, I think, paraphrasing is another skill that's really hard. So when I was in grad school, I spent a lot of time trying to just educate like psychology undergrads on how to write a scientific paper because it was just so different than anything they'd experienced when they were in high school.
You've also written extensively about your professional transition from academia to industry and quickly attracted a really large and growing following on social media. For listeners who may be thinking about leaving academia, first of all, they should follow Ashley Ruba. They should follow you. And we'll have your information and links in the show notes because you have a lot of really important things to say that are resonating and making an impact across the world. For listeners who may be thinking about leaving academia, either maybe during their program or after graduating, what sorts of advice can you share about how to navigate the logistical issues and also the emotional issues?
Yeah, it was definitely a very difficult decision that I made. So I decided to leave. I was for over 10 years, like throughout my PhD and through most of my postdoc, was really, I'm going to be a tenure track faculty member, R1, top 20 university in the US. That was really what I was aiming for. And by all accounts, I did all of the things that I needed to do for a variety of reasons. The pandemic in particular, like really decimated the academic job market. And all of a sudden it was 2022. I was in my third year of my postdoc and I was like, am I going to keep doing this? Like, how long am I going to keep doing this? And I decided that I didn't. There were just a variety of reasons where I just want to keep trying to get a tenure track job. And I was also just really eating away at my like, mental health. I struggle with anxiety and it wasn't really working for me as a career anymore. Out of a variety of reasons and kind of necessity for my own health, I decided to leave and pivot into a different career. But it was definitely felt a lot of grief because I had built this research program. I'd won all these awards. I'd published all these papers. Like everyone, when I told people I was leaving, everyone was just like completely shocked and a lot of comments like, We thought you would be the one who, like, in our cohort, we thought you'd be the one who would make it. Like, you seemed like you were definitely gonna make it, and so, yeah, I definitely felt like a lot of like, I was abandoning this thing that I had been working on for so long, like, building, and I was like, "No one else is going to wanna explore these ideas in science. We'll just never know," because I was, like, one of the only people, like, exploring this topic, which is an interesting thing to think about. Like, is it worth exploring a topic if no one else is actually interested in exploring it? But I think there's a lot of fear too. I was like really afraid of telling my advisors. Fortunately, everyone was, I think they're disappointed, but they're ultimately, you've clearly made up your mind. Like, let us know if you need anything, but they weren't actually able to provide any support because all they knew was academia. And so I had to do a lot of work on my own to figure out, what do I even want to do? Like, how do I even apply for jobs? I found Beyond the Professoria is a resource that I use, like, quite a lot, and they have a really great podcast that I recommend to everyone. And basically, any advice that I have for applying to jobs is in that podcast. So I learned a lot from them. And then over the course of the few months of applying for jobs and talking about these things, mostly on Twitter, I ended up running into other PhDs who were making the same career transition at the same time. And there really seemed to be like some momentum in this moment where before people weren't really publicly talking about, at least like in my experience, it didn't seem like many people were publicly talking about their transitions out of academia. It seemed like people would just very sadly leave and then disappear. But then we like really started just like talking publicly about it and sharing resources. And the response has just been completely unbelievable to me. Just like how many people have thanked me for just like talking about leaving, like not even like sharing advice, just like normalizing this thing that a lot of PhDs do and have to do because there aren't enough faculty jobs for everyone. At the end of the day, there's way more PhDs than faculty jobs, and that's just a numbers game. And it's just the state of the academic job market, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a lot of people have a lot of really hard feelings about leaving. They were not supported by their graduate programs. They have no professional development training and how to make this career transition. And I think a lot of people just feel really lost.
Yeah. Yeah. To me, as a non academic, I don't underestimate the emotional aspect of this because of the power of identity. This was your identity for so long. And then it's like you're shifting out of that, or it's part of your self identity, I should say. Now you're shifting out of that and you're not really sure what's going to come next. What are you going to be next professionally? And that can really be so unsettling for folks who are in jobs long term, particularly ones that are like all encompassing, like an academic job. For me, it was politics, right? It's an all encompassing kind of work. And then if I'm not doing politics, like who am I? What am I doing? And that can be really unsettling.
Oh, yeah. No, I think the identity crisis is really real because, like you said, you just poured so much of your life into this thing. And I really did not like overworking or working more than 40 hours a week. So I didn't. But I can imagine, especially if you've made so many sacrifices for this thing. I moved from Seattle to Wisconsin, where I didn't know anybody for my postdoc. Moved away from all of my friends. And then ultimately I moved back to Seattle because I was like, I miss it here. I want to be here. I want to be with my friends. I've heard the identity crisis a lot, especially when you've made just work so much a part of your life. It's what hobbies do I have? I'm enjoying figuring that out now because I don't feel it gave it a ton of thought necessarily.
When you didn't have time for it before.
Yeah, or just not that I didn't even have time for it, but I didn't have like the mental space for it. At the end of the day, I would just be so exhausted that I wouldn't be working, but I like wouldn't want to do anything else because I just been working so much during the day. I'm someone who like I don't want to make work my entire life. I really I liked academia, I like my current job, but I also really like spending time with my friends and going out and dancing and just exploring Seattle and all these other things.
Let's talk about your current job. You're a UX researcher at Meta. One thing I'm really curious about is what aspects of the environment have you found are reminiscent of academia and what's really different? I think you've talked about this a bit in your posts. For folks who are thinking like, what is it like over there? When I was in politics, it was like you're going to leave and work in the private sector.
Yeah.
As like like this big like Death Star, huge monolith thing. but it's much more nuanced and complicated than that.
Oh, so this is my second job, my second UXR job. I had another job for about 4 months before I ended up moving into Meta. And so those jobs were quite different. But I feel like my current job at Meta, like I'm in Reality Labs, which used to be Oculus, and then Meta purchased Oculus, and now it's Reality Labs. But I'm actually in the R&D side of Reality Labs, which feels very academic in a lot of ways because we're doing, I guess I'm not doing this research, but there are engineers and designers who are doing really fundamental research on technology, trying to build new augmented reality systems, new virtual reality systems. And as a user researcher, I'm collaborating with these engineers and these designers to take these really early prototypes of things that are still at least 5 years out from being a consumer product and actually testing them with people to what are things that people might want or need in a product that's very high tech, like very in the future. Like we don't really have anything like this right now. We have VR systems right now, but in terms of augmented reality, especially augmented reality glasses, which is what I've done a lot of work on, those don't really exist right now. And if you remember Google Glass from,
Right, I do.
yes. So we're trying to avoid a Google Glass situation because that was obviously like a really big failure of a product, at least for a consumer product. And so, yeah, we're really trying to figure out. I do a lot of work on social acceptability of new technology and yeah, just really trying to figure out like how we can build these things that are easy to use and are useful.
Very cool. You also were selected by AAAS as the inaugural representative psychologist with non-academic careers, which was created to help professional development for non-academic careers at the national and international levels. What can you tell us about your activities in the role and how this whole thing came to be at AAAS?
Yeah, so the whole thing came about from me posting on Twitter, which is very funny. But yeah, I got an email one day from the person who was, I believe it was the outgoing chair of the psychology section. She was like, "We have this new role." The role has actually been added to every single section of AAAS. So it's not just psychology, but there's all 24 sections, like all the areas of science, as a non academic rep now as of last month. And so she's, we wanted to fill this role. I've seen your work on Twitter. We think you'd be like a really great fit. Like, do you want to be like our first representative? We don't really know what this role is going to look like
Mm.
yet. And I was like, yeah, this sounds great. And so, yeah, I've been in this role for a month, but and I think because it is a new role, there's a lot of freedom potentially to develop this in a way that like I see fit and the other non-academic reps see fit. But it seems like like the 24 of us will be meeting and then collaboratively can figure out what can we do to improve science and like science education and training, at least from more informal polling and talking that I've done to PhD students. It seems like graduate training just does not prepare you at all for applying to non-academic jobs. I think departments are finally realizing that there's a need for this kind of development, but I think professors, some of them just don't know how to help and want to help. And then unfortunately, some professors and departments are actively fighting any PhD students from going into a non-academic career, which is really unfortunate. But I do feel like it's shifting a bit to where departments and faculty do want to support their students. They do want to provide these resources. They just don't really know how, to the extent that we can develop any kind of recommendations for graduate departments. And these are trainings or these are things that you should try to do professionally to help your students. That's what I'd like to do is to just try to fix this at a departmental level because right now I feel like in the work that I've done on social media, I'm just trying to put a band-aid on a problem that was created by just poor professional development and PhD programs.
This is something I've focused on. I started in 2018, actually at the AAAS conference is how it all started. There are just not the opportunities for those who want to go on a tenure track. And even if you aren't interested in that, like the training just being really focused as if everyone is going to pursue that. So it's a big, wide world out there, and you need skills beyond just ones on how to get your research published, for example, in a journal. Or so I'm really glad you're on the beat. That's so important. Let me ask you this as we wrap up. We're in 2023, first quarter of the year, and thinking about your own goals, whether they're goals or professional goals. Any thoughts about that this year?
Yeah, so I'm currently a contractor at Meta, and so one of my goals ideally is I would love to be full time. If not, I love working here. I love my current team. So if I'm not able to convert to full time here, being able to move somewhere else in Reality Labs for a full time role or potentially another company. I'm currently in Seattle, so that's a big professional goal I have this year. But of course, with all the tech layoffs and a lot of the tech layoffs, unfortunately, being for UX researchers, I am mindful that it is not a great time right now to be moving around in the tech space. So I'm adjusting my expectations as someone who's been on X or like more precarious employment for a while, having a full-time job with all of the benefits and all of that sounds really nice. And so that's definitely like my big professional goal for this year. And if not this year, then hopefully next year for sure. Yeah. And then other than that, like, I think personally, I just like recently moved back to Seattle a few months ago. So in many ways, I'm still getting my bearings here. I've been really focused on trying to build out my social network here and make friends and like deepen connections with friends that I have because as someone who has struggled with social anxiety for most of my life, that's been something that I haven't prioritized because especially as an academic, you can just pour yourself into work and not have to deal with making friends. So I think trying to like really get a handle on my anxiety and trying to go out and meet people and let my guard down more. That's something that I'm really trying to work on this year for sure too.
So inspiring. Thank you for that, Ashley, because so many of us deal with things like that. And it's really fantastic for you to talk about that. I know it's encouraging for a lot of people who are thinking the same as they're in their corner of the lab or the library and
Right.
but still wanting to get out there too, but trying to figure out how to do it.
Yeah.
Dr. Ashley Ruba, this has been a wonderful conversation, and thank you for the work that you're doing now. I'm just talking about across the social channels, what I know is bringing comfort and insight and some humor to thousands of people all over the place, and that's just wonderful. So thank you for that and for your current work.
Oh, well, yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. This is a lot of fun.
And listeners, thanks for being here on this episode of When Science Speaks. And I hope you'll be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to click subscribe. Check us out on the web at whensciencespeaks.com, and we'll see you next time.